Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And so lovely to see so many familiar faces and some new ones as well. Oh, yes, I'm going to change the slide. First question. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Right, thank you so much, Shiva, for inviting me to speak as well for your work organising. So today I'm going to talk about not too much about Minai ware. Those of you who know me will be mercifully spared too much of that. But I am going to talk about my newly completed monograph on Lajvardina ware, which is in the process of being peer reviewed at the moment. So any suggestions are gratefully received at this stage. So rather than try and summarise the whole book, which would take far too long and would be not very compelling for those of you who are completely obsessed with ceramic sherds and taxonomy nerds, so don't worry too much about that. But I will focus on a few key elements, including those that can in various ways be related to Persian manuscript paintings. Primarily, I'm talking about the ones in the Great Mongol Shahnameh. For those of you who know the manuscript, because it's one of the most amazing manuscripts, but also because chronologically it fits with the sort of material that I'm talking about, late 13th, early 14th century. Now, I'm not going to address the later phase of Lajvardina ware, which was produced in Central Asia and Russia, or the historiography of the rediscovery and more recent publication and display of this material, all of which, along with the prevalence of fakes and forgeries in the art market, which is my other favourite subject I won't be touching on today, I have addressed in considerable detail in the book, so coming to publish it in a bookshop near you soon. So I'll start with what is the primary question: what is Lajvardina? Now, in essence, the term Lajvardina, from the Persian Lajvard, for lapis lazuli, and this reference being to the colour, not the actual stone, primarily refers to cobalt blue glazed wares with red, gold, and white overglazed decoration. Made of stone paste, which is a mix of ground quartz, white clay, and ground glass, also called faience. These were first produced in the wider Arabian world during the Ilkhanid period, so the late 13th and into the 14th century. Unlike the technically similar but more figural and mostly white Minai wares, there are far more Lajvardina tiles than there are vessels, and it's the tiles that I'll mainly be focusing on today. There are a number of reasons for this, one being the far larger number of tiles, the other being the high degree of levels of reconstruction, restoration, and modern overpainting that nearly all vessels have experienced over the last century and century and a half, since they first came to the attention of scholars and collectors in Europe, Japan, and North America. But to understand the origins of Lajvardina, it is to the earlier Minai wares that our attention must briefly turn. The term I use for the material that can be clearly defined as Minai, in the broad understanding of the term, but which features elements more commonly associated with Lajvardina, is transitional wares, and this was first coined for this purpose by the late Gezer, formerly of this parish. So he taught in this building, but he did teach just across the road. Now here we can see sherds of three separate Minai vessels. The one on the right is a bowl base in Berlin. It's quite typical of Minai in its design, with a large or monumental, to use Oliver Watson's term, rider and areas of relief decoration. However, if you look closely at the textile of the rider, it consists of deep blue with angular cut pieces of gold leaf and red and white overglazed decoration that are elements much more commonly found on the later Lajvardina wares. In the middle is a wonderful jewel-like sherd from a cavetto bowl in the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon that has the white base glaze and black cursive script common to much Minai, but there are bands of blue and turquoise with cursive gold outlined in red, which is not common on Minai ware and is more reminiscent of Lajvardina. Now on the right, you see a piece that has previously been described in scholarship as Lajvardina, but it's actually a lighter tone of blue and has decorative elements more commonly found on white glazed pieces of Minai. So this piece highlights the problems raised by trying to fit evolving, varied, and dynamic modes of medieval production into modern taxonomic categories, and such terms can only ever be used as a guide. For every rule there'll be exceptions, but like learning English. I want to say quickly here that I'm a big proponent of the value of sherds, fragments of ceramic vessels, as they will tell you part of a true story, as opposed to the seemingly complete but often fraudulently restored pieces that regularly circulate in the art market and are on display in many of the major museums. These will often lie to you, not to be trusted. Equally hard to either date or categorize are a group of turquoise glazed tiles with molded relief decoration featuring mounted figures. Now, they have elements that can be associated both with Minaiware regarding the figural decoration and the range of colours, and Lajvardina in terms of the angular gold with red outline and white accents on a cobalt blue glazed area. The piece on the left is in the Hermitage, while the one on the right is in St. Louis. And I should make a point here, when I was putting the PowerPoint together, I really wanted to focus on the objects, and especially when we come to reuniting dispersed tiles, to view them as a single corpus rather than where they happen to be now. But then writing it, I thought I should explain where they all are, which kind of undermined my whole point. So apologies for that. There was a reason to not put it on there, and I've undermined it myself. But we'll continue nonetheless. And in some, there seems to have been a progressive shift from one technique to the other, with a degree of continuity, as can be seen in the coeval production of lusterwares, rather than there having been some big direct rupture, which has often been considered to be the case. So, having looked at what isn't really Lajvardina, let's look at something that is. So, to address the origin, I'll just look at a few examples of the sorts of vessel forms that the corpus consists of before moving on to the tiles. Unlike earlier production and also continuous luster production, there are actually very few bowls made in Lajvardina. Far more of them are vertical closed forms. Bottles, let's see this one on the left of the Louvre, ewers, this one on the right, as well as albarelli being particularly popular. And they're both typical here as they have this sort of ubiquitous fictive ribbing that's designed on the bottom that virtually every Lajvardina vessel has, and most other styles don't seem to use. And they also lack any figural decoration or any inscriptions. So I said there's not many bowls, but there are a few, and this is what most of the ones look like. There are either 4, 6, or very occasionally 8 divisions, and there's a very limited number of white Lajvardina wares. Now, having explained that the Lajvardina is to do with the colour, it's also to do with the technique. It's clearly not about the colour. In this particular instance, it's mostly white. But they have identical forms, decorations, and production methods, substituted with black overglazed lines rather than white for obvious reasons. We'll be able to see the white and white background. And as far as I know, there are only white Lajvardina bowls known. Always happy to hear of any other pieces people know about. But as far as I know, there's only white bowls. There are several white tiles, but not any any white bowls, white vessels other than bowls. And there's ones sort of spread around lots of different collections. Now, in contrast to Minai, of which thousands and thousands of sherds are known, I mean, the museum in Tehran alone has over 1,000 fragments of Minai. But there's very, very few sherds of Lajvardina known. And that's not including all the ones that have been stuck back together and sold as complete wares. That's a different story. So that might explain why there's not many sherds around. No. But putting those aside, there are very, very few examples. There's literally handfuls in the major collections, and most big museums don't even have any. So they are surprisingly rare, given that there are quite a lot of restored vessels around. Here we'll just see a few examples in Berlin, Paris, Bamberg, and Tehran. But this, albeit small corpus of sherds, can act as both a control, which allows us to check the authenticity and reliability of the form and decoration on these numerous restored pieces. But they also can be used to provide evidence for pieces that are otherwise unknown in the corpus of restored pieces in the art market. So there's lots of fragments of pieces that aren't seen in the restored corpus, as well as knowing there's ones that are. What becomes more suspicious is that there's no fragments known and seemingly perfect pieces appearing with no damage at all. That does set my, albeit rather suspicious, mind racing. And also some, but by no means all, of these sherds have that incredibly elusive thing in the field of Islamic ceramics, provenance. And I don't mean whichever rich person got conned into buying it by a dealer 100 years ago, actual provenance of where did it come from. There's always about an 800-year gap in most commercial provenance. So this means we can actually start to trace the medieval distribution. It won't tell us where they were made, there's not found any kilns for these things. Tiles, we do know some made in Tactisun, but vessels, not really. But it does at least allow us to track the distribution. How were these things traded? What sort of places are they found? Is it an elite residence? Is it princely, courtly, reserved? To at least start to get an understanding of how they might be used. Now, moving on, if we're looking at reuniting dispersed fragments, Now, one aspect of Islamic ceramics, which is particular to tiles, is this reuniting of dispersed corpora to try and understand and decontextualize single or small groups of items when they're no longer in the milieu for which they were originally made. The question is, how can inscription tiles really be understood when their primary purpose by the person who made them, commissioned them, and the first people to look at them was to deliver a textual message that has become lost when just part of a word or a small phrase remains? Also, they have to bear in mind that these things were viewed and experienced alongside metalwork, textiles, wood, and glass, as well as the even harder to quantify oral elements, to music and trickling water, and the olfactory elements, aspects, flowers and scents, all of which formed part of the context in which these now single decontextualized elements operated. They all combined with a mix of textures and patterns to create a holistic aesthetic where everything played its part. And getting even a glimpse through the veil of time must surely be at the heart of any art historical inquiry that seeks to understand aspects of material culture from the past. And part of this process is to at least digitally reunite the dispersed elements of individual friezes, bedos, mihrabs, and panels, as well as using manuscript paintings, get the paintings eventually, and as a guide to how various surviving objects might have originally been combined more broadly. Now, arguably, the most quintessential type of Lajvardina tiles are the large square inscription tiles. They're about 30 centimeters square, so fairly substantial individually, but when running across dozens of meters of a building, become more than the sum of their parts in the true sense of the word. They bear these gold inscriptions that appear to float in free space, with the cobalt blue background seeming to recede into the infinite distance behind like the starry firmament of the night sky. Close study of the extant corpus has allowed for the identification of 4 subgroups of this type. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of them. You can take my word for it. There's 4 very similar but distinct subgroups. And I've been focusing on one particular one of those to try and track them all down, or as many as possible, to try and understand how it might have worked as a complete entity rather than dispersed fragments. And in a way, you could view individual tiles like sherds in a restored vessel. They're all part of a larger whole. So here we've got one that's currently just around the corner, actually, which gives us good care. And the one that was originally placed next to it in a yet-to-be-found building is this one that's now in Oxford, in the Ashmolean. So through some rather dogged, some might say pathologically obsessive detective work over the last few years, I've managed to track down 16 full or partial tiles from this one frieze. And this allows for a better understanding of how they fit together, and to, for the first time in a long time, to emerge a real understanding of what they look like and what they actually said in its more complete entirety. And I do have the Quranic text here at the back, but I won't go through it right now. Suffice to say, it deals with the things in the very essence of Islam, submission to God, its all-powerfulness, and the reward for the believers, being paradise with trees providing shade and rivers providing water. So here's just a selection of pieces found from as far afield as Russia, France, Malaysia, America, and the UK, with the least glamorous location award surely going to the piece with the rather fetching turquoise background, which is in Stoke-on-Trent. Those of you who know. Those of you who don't, massively spared the delights. Yet, as far as I can tell, there are none in Iran. There's lots of similar ones in Gom, but none from this actual frieze. And this is also the case for the luster star tiles from the Imams like the Yahya and Baramil, and the luster frieze tiles from Natanz, from the Al-Samad shrine with the chipped birds heads, which are also quite well distributed around the major collections. And I believe a tiny little fragment was recently excavated there, but that's the only one that's turned up. So putting all these together, and it becomes apparent that although there's still a lot missing, it's possible to determine broadly where the inscription starts. There are also on top of this, there's 2 tiles, one of which includes the Bismillah canon for sale in New York recently. So we know it begins here and starts at Quran 3190 and goes through to at least halfway through 195. But given that it doesn't really make sense if you cut the last half of that bit off, it probably did extend through to the end of the surah. No idea which building it's from. There's no obvious surviving building from which there's a gap. Sometimes you can trace the gap that the tile's actually taken from. It doesn't appear to be here. There's a mention of from a building in Tabriz in the records in Sèvres, but I've not managed to find a building in Tabriz that's missing them. And given how complete a lot of them are, that does suggest they were taken from a standing building and a few broke in the process of removal. When they're all broken, are buildings that have been collapsed and excavated, you end up with very small pieces of tile for the most part. And when you start getting lots of complete tiles, it does suggest that they're taken off the walls of the standing building. But again, that's the drifting shop art history of historian engaging in conjecture, drifting into the arena of conjecture, but no more than that. So this allows us to take decontextualize single tiles, understand where their compatriots are around the world, and start to get a sense of what the original intention of the inscription actually was. And it's not only this frieze that such an approach can be applied. I've been able to reunite, albeit digitally, almost all of one of the only two known monumental Lajvardina sarcophagus panels, the tripartite luster examples are known, the most famous probably being the one from Natanz that's now in New York, in the Met. And the other, only the upper part of the other one is in Berlin from the Flores collection. But here we can see two sections that were among the first Lajvardina tiles to ever be published. In 1893, Wallace published this image of the tiles that are owned by Duquesne Ordman and MSDM. But it's taken over a century for the rest to come to light, as we see here. So the top right corner is in the Khalili, bottom below that is in the Cooper Hewitt, and a half tile below that recently appeared at auction in London, having been in the private European collection. So just over half of the bottom tile is still missing in one corner, but there's enough to start putting together all the inscriptions and understand a bit more about who it was for. And named after the dealer that cut it up and sold it, George Dumont. It dates from the 1330s and is one of the finest and most diverse illustrated copies of Ferdowsi's Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, especially from the pre-Safavid period. It was a product of and included depictions of the milieu in which the Lajvardina tiles that are found in so many collections around the world, as well as fragmentarily excavated from Suleiman, were produced and used in such large numbers. So it can be used judiciously as a mirror into the past. So here we see an image of the King Zav enthroned now in the Sackler Gallery. And while he was a figure from the distant past even then, the setting is entirely contemporaneous to the time it was painted. We look at the spandrels of the large Pishka arch. Here. You can see the same sort of patterns that are used in blue and gold in this combination on this tile on the right, from the Clear Chasta and Kiosk and Konya. On the right, a fragment of a tile from Takti Suleiman. There's a little more overtly vegetal, but still has the same general aesthetic. And if we look at this next image from the Great Marble Shahnameh, it shows what appears to be examples of Lajvardina tiles in their original wider context. Now, this scene depicts Faridun born in Miraj and is also in the Sackler, and it features two different types of very distinctive and overtly defined definitively Lajvardina tiles. On the lower part of the dado are hexagonal tiles of the same type as have been found at the site of the Ilkhanid Palace in Takti Suleiman in northwest Iran, which feature a range of different creatures as well as vegetal motifs, including the tufted lion, that is a very notable Chinese motif that is found on earlier textiles from China and speaks to the links to China that we want to talk to Iran. Here's two examples in the National Museum in Tehran, both from the same mold, one of which is the less common but still not incredibly rare turquoise variant. Again, further highlighting the fact that although the term Lajvardina primarily refers to the blue colour, it also encompasses a variety of different coloured wares decorated using the same technique. Also from the same painting, above those tiles, is a frieze of rectangular tiles with what appear to be phoenixes, and definitely, even if phoenixes may be a stretch, are definitely avian in nature, I think we'd agree. They highlight the ways in which the various types of now decontextualized tiles in museums were originally installed and formed part of this much larger, rich interior aesthetic with brick, woodwork, metal, and textiles. And I'll return to this type of tile and its imagery in a bit. Now, although not depicted in paintings in the Great Mongol Shahnameh, the most common type of Lajvardina tile to survive, with examples found in numerous sites and now dispersed around the world, are the star and cross. Consisting of 8 pointed stars and pointed tip crosses, there's a wide range of types of decoration, both zoomorphic and vegetal, not any known in this particular type of tile. Anthropomorphic, but there are examples of them in different techniques, and luster tiles are known, for example. And these ones are all in Los Angeles, and they give just a hint of how it would have appeared when you combine large numbers on the wall of a palace or other elite structure. And this idea of luxury and usage is quite a thorny issue. I mean, is any type of non-imported Chinese ceramic really luxurious? Arguably not. You know, if you're really, really wealthy, you've got gold. If you've got quite a bit of money, you're going to have bronze, high-tin bronze or brass inlaid with precious metals. And ceramics come a fair way down the pecking order in terms of vessels. But when it comes to tiles, you know, maybe anyone can save up and buy a bowl or a cup. But when you need thousands of tiles to revet a palace, that's real money. And that speaks to real elite by any stretch of the imagination. Whether that's necessarily limited to the court or the ruler is debatable, but certainly it's the very highest echelon of society. Now, these sorts of tiles are found in monochrome and luster and would have formed a very rich revetment with a range of reflective and chromatic effects. So you often see the same tiles in the same mold, decorated in different techniques in the same context. And it speaks to the variety of different approaches that were being taken by the people creating these interior spaces to make them as impressive as humanly possible. So you have actual gold, which reflects light one way, luster, which flashes like gold, but then goes brown and then disappears depending on as you move across the space. So they were used in a very sophisticated manner to achieve a lot of different things. So although this is primarily focusing on Lajvardina, it's important to remember that they were only ever one part of a much richer interior aesthetic. Now, if we move on to a specific type of tile, we saw one very briefly with the phoenix, also used to represent the similar creature used in the Shahnameh, but depicted in very much the same way. There are some cases when the Huma bird is depicted in the ceremony, but they're less common. So I'm not mentioning that today. Now, this motif is used in a range of other media at a variety of scales and was introduced into Iran in the Ilkhanid period as the Chinese phoenix, long associated with royalty, like the dragon. Long-standing royal connotations, but also became used to represent the symbol. So this cross-cultural polyvalent meaning of symbols and motifs is typical of the artistic exchanges and innovations that were underway across Asia during the 13th and 14th centuries, and adds to both the richness and the complexity and the challenges of their study. Now, here's a page from what is generally known as the first small Shahnameh, with a painting of Sam greeting his son Ghazal and the Simur. It's dated to about 1320, now in Met. This is a very small painting. This measures 5.2 centimeters by 12. It's literally this sort of size. It's a small painting. It does look very grand and impressive on here, but it is a very miniature painting, much smaller than the ones on the tiles, just for some sense of context. Now, Zal is the father of the hero Rustam. He's the white-haired albino child who was abandoned and saved by the Simur. And there is a striking degree of uniformity to the way that this bird is depicted across scale and media. faces can change, figures can change, buildings change. And for some reason, this phoenix similar motif is almost always, there is one exception I'll show you, there always is an exception, but it generally very, very closely follows a formula that we will see here in one example. It's the tail feathers and the head are the two kind of main things to point at in terms of how similar they look. And just looking a little closer, you can see it's the ridged, almost sawtooth-like tail divided into 5 pieces, 5 or 6 pieces, and often a very narrow neck because distinctively fork-like and sharp beak. And if we look at this tile here, so this is one of the largest epigraphic tiles that's known. This is on display. The one on the right is on display in the British Museum at the moment. It was given to the museum by the former keeper, Wollaston Franks, and while having lost a lot of its overglazed decoration, it has an upper frieze with a phoenix of exactly the same type as seen in the painting, along with a dragon. Now, the one on the right, the one on the left, is from Takti Suleiman, excavated there, now in Berlin. And is a rare example of a Lajvardina tile that is primarily blue, but also has areas of turquoise as the base glaze. But it retains not only a lot more of its gilding, but it also this very distinctive white decoration with red outline, which there's hints at on this tile, but that's been cleaned at some point or just the state of preservation in the ground. However, it was found has resulted in a great loss, so you can see a little bit more of the sense in this fragment of what the complete one would have looked like. And it's a Persian inscription, so it was certainly from a secular context rather than the religious ones we saw earlier. The commonality of approach can also be seen on these very large frieze tiles. This is very large, again, the same, basically the same size as the ones we saw earlier with the inscription. They're from the same mould, almost certainly from Takti Suleiman, and pieces in the art market can't be certain of that, but fragments of these have been found there, so it's very safe to assume that's where they're from. And this has an even larger representation of the phoenix than we just saw on the other tiles. And again, you see the same identical elements, the way the tail feathers are done and the way the head is done. But you can also see just how different a visual effect you can achieve with exactly the same basic piece of stone paste material, depending on what type of glaze you use, what type of overglaze. And luster never works in photographs. It's a thing that needs light shining on it and you to move. So they always look muddy and brown. And if how did anyone ever care about these? But when you go and look at them, suddenly they come alive and they flash and they speak to you, and suddenly you're like, oh, okay, yes, now I can see why people are willing to despoil monuments and smuggle things around the world because they became enamored with them so much. Even the Arabic word ajab, wonder, is the way that it's described. It shines like the sun is the other description of it. And if we just do a little comparison, you can see, although this seems largely complete, this is in the Okayama Museum in Japan, and it wasn't actually complete, so they let in a piece from one of these tiles to complete it. So it's a different design. They're trying to paint it to fit it in a bit, and does take a rather nerdy obsessiveness to spot it. But again, it just shows you have to critically view all these pieces, even the ones that look complete aren't. But it's also a way to track down yet another piece, albeit can't identify which piece from the inscription band, but it's another piece from that specific group. So it all speaks to this sort of need for very close looking, ideally in person. So that does involve quite a lot of travel to museums, but that's luckily what I consider a holiday, so it's not that thing. Fortunately, my wife doesn't agree, but that's a whole other story. It's played by a divorce from my first one. And if we look very closely at the tile, the original part of the tile, you can see just how detailed the approach is to try and give a sense of life and dynamism and something that gives it sort of, it's got things that look like scales, it's got these chevron motifs, lots of things that build on a basic design and make it even more dynamic and individual compared to the luster ones, which again, if we go back, very quickly. So they take a very different approach to the decoration of the body using the same basic mold. I'm making everything very difficult. It's trying to catch up with here, sorry. Right, okay, we're back on track. Now, this on the left is a detail of one of the tiles in the Musée National de Céramique in Sèvres, that same mold, but this time turquoise, and a slightly different approach, again, taken to how the body and the leaves and the wings, and feathers on the wings are decorated. But also just to have a little bit of this wider context, this is one of the so-called Sultana bag style wares with a green slip and an ink-glazed decoration. Same period, same cultural context, and as you can see, an almost identical way of depicting this same mythical bird. And I won't touch too much on vessels, but I think I'm going to leave them out completely, just to show that there's some degree of uniformity, even if they're not necessarily symbolics, but the depiction of avian creatures, of bird-like creatures, on these three different vessels from a range of different collections. This one is in the South. Oh, no, sorry, this isn't the South. This one is in Montreal, and then we're back to the glamours of Stoke-on-Trent, it's unpublished already. That just shows that across different vessel forms, different ways, different things being depicted, there's something about depicting birds in a certain way that they seem to not be able to deviate from, even though they would innovate in lots of other ways in terms of people responsible for them. What am I doing for time? I think I'm going to get this out. It'll drag me out. Lots of reading about it.
As much time as we
Okay, good. We're nearly there. Now here, anyone who knows this tile from the museum in Tehran knows that I digitally chopped out the plastic. That was what was actually found. The restoration I removed because it offended my eye. But this is the dragon, very distinctively four-clawed rather than five, as a sort of nod to the Great Khan. His tiles with dragons and pictures of dragons had the 5 claws, so the Ilkhans, they knew their place. They were important, but we're not quite that important, so we'll lose the thumb. But again, you do see this uniformity in the depiction of the dragon. It's got a lot of commonality, but you can see just how different they look with different techniques. So you have a blue Lajvardina, a luster, and a very distinctive type of Lajvardina on this. Is it white? Is it turquoise? It's a bit of a Schrodinger's glaze, really determine exactly what's going on. But it's very distinctive, only seems to be found in Turkey. But again, using the same mold to produce very different visual effects, by the dragon being white on blue as opposed to solid black on the luster on white. So same basic aesthetic, but creating very different effect. When you see these sort of appearing in the art market or in museums, it's a fairly safe bet to assume that half of them have to sort of know. Although we do know the site was pillaged from fairly early on. There's churches in Armenia that have tiles that were of the type found in Turkish Suleiman. So there was a secondary market for these things in the medieval and early modern period. So it's not a uniquely European outrageous obsession with taking tiles and putting them somewhere else together. It seems to really round it form in the 10th century when it doing that. Yes, just to have a little look at the detail close up. So just some of the variations, I think it broadly seems similar. The whole actually is just blue and red. Well, yes, I could say that. But within that, there is a lot of variation, and it is something that isn't particularly well studied. So that's what I'm wanting to correct. And if we just look at this one piece here, you'll see that it's a seemingly unique, as far as I know, fragment in the Freer Study collection. And it's the one example of kind of a slightly different approach, but a slightly more duck head, like collection, a single long tail, but still a very similar looking animal. So it just goes to show, for any rules, there was exceptions, especially when it comes to studying medieval ceramics. So, don't trade in absolutes in this field. It's not going to help you. But it does help these taxonomic categories, these terms. They do at least help trying to find a way through a very diverse corpus of material, but none of them are perfect and should be recognized as tools rather than an end in themselves. But this one on the right is a much more complete. It's missing the say third, but it does give you a sense of what the Lajvardina tile would look like. But it does have a slightly different look, so it does suggest that there's no single rule, there's no uniformity, but there is, these are all certainly from the same mold. So I think that's, I was able to get through and see it and that, but it does give you a sense of what the sort of thing would look like. Now I'll move on to the final part of the talk now, and unlike dragons and phoenixes, and indeed a number of other animals, the depiction of humans of any type on Lajvardina is incredibly rare. Just one complete and one repaired tile are known, along with a few fragments, and in all cases they consist of riders, and they're only found on tiles, so you don't see any figures on vessels, and you see very few on tiles. And this in contrast to Minoan ware, where it's mostly vessels and hardly any tiles, and a good 2/3, arguably more, all feature figures, and often riders, but also seated figures, actually scenes, various other sorts of figural scenes. So why this isn't entirely clear. Anyone who has any suggestions, I'm all ears. I'm definitely not closed-minded. I just can't think of any particular reason why that might be. But there are also large numbers in contemporaneous manuscripts. So it's not that there was some problem with depicting figures. At the same time as these tiles are being made, all of these manuscript production is ramping up, and there's people all over them. And so it's not entirely clear why that might be. But like I say, always more questions and answers. That is what keeps us interested. So this on the left is about this sort of size. So the mid-size is very heavily repaired, but it does seem to be from pieces of original tiles. And it's formerly owned by the art dealer and tastemaker Dick Van Vlekian, recently sold at auction. There are always these figures, always in low relief, and there's just a few small fragments. There's one, so this we don't know where it is now, but these are all in France, either in Sèvres or in the Louvre, or this one it was in private collection, the Jean Soustier's collection, I don't know where it is now, but so they're all in France. Which isn't surprising. France had the monopoly on Persian antiquities for a long time. Into the early 20th century, so Paris is the main centre of art. And that, in fact, really gave refuge to Armenians who were very central to the art market as well, because they were Christians, so a combination of Armenians from the Ottoman Empire and the closed shop deal on getting started out early on in Paris, the main centre for Islamic art until London took. But these are small fare compared to this piece, monumental, 50 centimeters high, 40 centimeters wide, even with the edge being trimmed off slightly. It's in Miho Museum, a private museum, it's a small, it's a private museum in Japan. And it's without question the most striking, large, and complete Lajvardina tile currently known. Located in Kyoto, the museum acquired it from J. Gluck, who was a colleague of after Pope. But other than that, like almost all commercially traded Lajvardina, it has no other problems. It's one of the highlights of Miho's very impressive collection. Has a rabbit and two large quadrupeds on this upper register. In the main area features a pair of mounted figures, one with a hunting cheetah on the back. Horse, pounce, while crane-like birds seem to soar through the air above them. The type of vegetation in the background, the narrow band at the base, all correspond to similar tiles found in Cactus Suleiman. But while no tiles sections of Lajvardina have been found at the site, it is the most likely source. But there's always the risk that if you assume it's the local source, it's the only one we have, then everyone assumes everything's from Samara. This is the parcel, so the excavator that we start excavating other parcels, so it's something that we've been supposed to be Samara's found there as well. So I'm loath to assume that is the case, but in lieu of any other evidence, this is where we are. And for many years, it was thought that this tile was a unicorn, and some people were even suspicious of it because of this. But recently, the upper section of another tile that was made with the same mold, with exactly the same dimensions, appeared on the art market auction in London. So although the lower part is missing, it is evidence that there having been multiple examples of this massive type of Lajvardina tile produced. And this is another example of not only how much of the original Corbusson produced material is lost, but just how much must remain out in private hands, unknown to scholars, waiting to appear. People can be as rude as they like about the art market and collectors, but without them, there'd be nothing to really. This stuff wouldn't have been dug out of the ground and sold in the first place in many cases. So it's by far from problematic, but we don't want to throw the baby out of the bathwater. Now, the significance of this tile is hard to overstate, being so much larger than any other sort of tile or figural decoration, and just the fact that it's figural at all. And despite the surface losses, it's testament to the scale and potential impact that a whole frieze of such tiles must have had running along the length of a no doubt large and impressive building when they were first made. Close to, if not more than, the majority of the whole surface of the tile would probably have been gilded, with the blue largely forming just small background areas. And we can see where the gold has come away, so we can underneath it, but just how much of the area would have been gold, all inside these vertical areas, all over the boards, all over the road. So it would have been primarily a gold tile with a blue background. So you have to try and understand the original appearance. It would be even more impressive than it is now. Plus, you start adding 30 of them in a row with all the decorative tiles below it and the carpets and the textiles, and the level of opulence would put the modern setting palaces to shame. So it's just how impressive and, I think the term I used earlier today, the Google exhibition is nothing exceeds like excess, and that's very much the watchword for this sort of material. So I have this brief overview of just a few aspects of Lajvardina where there's been of some interest. And thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, do feel free to ask.
It was absolutely nice. I'm sure the audience enjoyed that one as I did. Looks like a very friendly gathering, so no need to have this kind of official selection of who to ask. So please, yeah, I think we have some things to.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
No,
So
you tell me when I'm getting kicked out, and I'll stop talking about it.
So allow me to, oh, sorry.
Could you just say a bit more about, I guess, this building,
Yeah.
And how that is applied and protected?
So as far as I can tell, it's some sort of natural oil, probably hammer oil, that's used as a fixer. So they put a layer of oil, hammered gold leaf. The Baghdadi Jews are well known for being the best producers of gold leaf, but we don't know if that would necessarily be imported or was being made.
So which oil again?
Hammered oil,
Which is
it's from a plant. It's a plant-based oil. So like linseed oil. Seed. Linseed oil. There have been tests done, so it has been shown that at least in some cases, hammer oil is used linseed oils and stuff. And really, it just you put that on as an adhesive. As it dries, it turns into a thick glue-like material. If you leave a tank of petrol for long enough, it turns into shellac. It's that sort of idea. It loses the moisture and glues it on. Also, if we think about
so it's not fired on, or is it fired on?
Sometimes they're fired on, sometimes they're not. The firing doesn't really seem to make much of a difference because it's not mechanically bond gold into the glaze. The glaze softening slightly might help, but it's the overglaze pigments pinning the edge down also helps.
And is the horse luster on?
No, that is just it's the same red pigment. It's quite unusual to have a large area of red. It's hematite, so it's rust, basically. Material is with red. So yes, sometimes it is fired, but more for the purpose of fixing the overlays onto it rather than
Or maybe just mildly heated sort of thing, rather than that sort of.
Yeah, so it's a lower temperature for all of the overlays. It's a muffled kiln they use, which is a lower temperature kiln. So,
And the enamels are on after the.
yes, so well, not always. That's just to make it awkward. Sometimes the gold is applied and the pigments on top of it. So an example of that is the back to where those birds were. Here we go. Yes, so here you've got large areas of gold applied in the shape of the bird and the red applied on top, and that would have to be fired. Whereas on most of the tiles, they lay the decoration out and put the gold on afterwards. So clearly the gold doesn't seem to make like it's firing off because the precondition of it staying in place. Because it's sort of an element of stuff. The only advantage might be, say, if you soften the glaze enough, it could start to sink into the main glaze. And in terms of the main process, you have to fire it once to get a cobalt blue glaze, and then the pigments go on top of it. So it's at least 2 firings. Some people have said, "Oh, there's 3 because you need a crystal firing," but as that fire is remade, or mainly makes luster, it's the same production process. And instead you don't need to do it this good fire to drive it up, you actually get more on. It's very long-winded, but I say they stick it on the oil. So. Yes, that's correct.
So that's the main reason you can't find, rarely we can see it in a good condition.
Yeah, because it's not chemically bonded. Like luster, you can't really rub the luster off. I mean, if you scrape it enough, you get through the glaze layer that it's bonded to, but it won't rub off. Whereas this is just gold leaf that you can literally scratch it off, almost with your neck. It'll come off easily, which isn't a problem on tiles. Because essentially, once they're put up on the wall, they're not really getting touched that much. Even on a day that they might rub against it a little bit. It's more problematic on vessels because they're getting handled. And as soon as they're broken and in the ground, it's yeah.
Another technical question about how they're made, but so my background is in numismatics originally, and particularly working on die counts. So talking about molds, kind of my ears pricked up. It seems like a very similar way of thinking about material. And I've got lots of questions about. I've never really thought about molded tiles from the point of view of the actual molds themselves, but I'll limit myself to one for now. I was very struck by the fact that you didn't have, although you were able to find repeat molds in for the simmer and for the dragon, there weren't any epigraphic ones.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that the cost of making an epigraphic frieze would be so much greater than having to make an individual mold for every single element rather than just having one and being able to produce multiple.
They have a solution for that. They thought about that and realized that wasn't going to work. So what they have is have a single blank. That's that mold. So that's how you can see the different patterns from different sequences. They make one mold and then make another one that's similar. So they make lots of tiles that look like this. And then it's called luting, where they make the letters out of thick, like clay dried to sort of leather hard. So they cut the letters out, stick them on before you can fire the first firing, and that bonds them together. And when you see broken ones, you can look and see there's a clear separation where you've got the continuous body of the tile and a little line where the bit's been stuck on. So they won't come off very easily. I mean, they're bonded in, but they're not molded.
But they're
So that's the difference. So you've got a mold that's got this is in relief. You've just got a flat section, and then the inscription. So it's still very way more expensive because you make one of these molds, then you can have 50, 100, 200 similar fairly cheaply. You want to have 50 tiles with a Quranic inscription now, again, which is why you're more likely to see that on something like a religious building that is designed to last. Palaces, even lavish ones, aren't designed to last. Even if they look very lavish, they're usually thrown together because nobody wants to live in the last guy's palace. And everyone's worried that they're going to get separated at the neck by their soon-to-be replacement. So if you want to live in a nice valley, build it cheaply and quickly and make it look nice and showy. That's why they have a lot of stucco patterns, because you can cover it with gold and ground up lapis and make it look like this, but you can get it done, stamp them out, stamp them on the wall with an eye on the vizier, sharpening his sword over your shoulder. Yes.
Those tiles in Imams of the Yahya in Varamin, they seem to have a different combination of colors. Can you elaborate a little bit on those?
The Yahya ones, it depends on the firing. So it's all luster. It's all ostensibly a single color luster. But each batch that gets fired at slightly different conditions, even different parts of the kiln, hotter and colder. So you'll get luster flashing, and you'll get luster where the line where the luster was, it burns off completely and bleeds out. So it gives you this sort of more reddish tone and a different visual appearance. So using even using exactly the same mix of metal oxides and lemon juice to make it, to apply onto it, and the same mold, and the same calligrapher or the same artisans, but just with one being on the top of the kiln and one being on the bottom, and look slightly different colours.
That's true, yes.
So they're meant to look broadly the same, but there isn't, I think we have a more kind of post-industrial obsession with uniformity. And there's a lot of cases where you see things that obviously something went wrong. Like there's examples where the glaze would creep away. And you think, well, that's clearly a second, or the luster's almost burned off completely. But they still would do the next stage. They still add the gold and still put on the building. So whether that's, it's high enough up, no one will see, which I think is a bit too easy. I think it's that there wasn't an obsession with perfection and consistency. I think the fact that they've got variation is what makes them special, what makes them different. You see that often that's where people faking these things go wrong, is they make them too well. They don't make any mistakes. And it's the mistakes, which is a pejorative term, but it's more the variations might be a better term to use. It's the variations from the norm that actually gives them that feel that makes them feel right.
Also imagining that they were looking at these tiles with the light of the torches, which will be a little bit like flickering, and it gives that shine coming and going, and makes it even more mesmerizing.
Yeah, we're looking at these things often in quite harsh, flat electric light.
Exactly.
And they were either going to be in incredibly bright sunlight at a certain point of the day and dazzling, and you couldn't see if they were black or white. It's just like, or muted as clouds come over, or at dawn and dusk, and then, as I say, different types of candlelight.
Yes.
And from much lower down, the dados are only up to about here, where people would be generally sitting on the floor, so you're immersed in a glazed world.
Right.
The other decorations higher up, whether it's wall paintings, painted stucco, hanging textiles, you're not looking straight at them, looking up at them, and they have a different visual effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You showed a beautiful fragment, which was from Konya.
Yes.
I'm not sure if, I think it was Minai, actually.
Yes, it is sort of, it's Minai in as much as the tiles that were found with it are Minai.
Any evidence of any proof of manufacture at Konya?
No, nothing. It's the only building, the Kilit Arslan kiosk is the only building in the whole of Anatolia that has had any Minai found.
I mean, can they be imported tiles?
Almost certainly. Yeah, I mean, there's luster found at Kubadabad, and there's evidence of production of luster. I think some are imported and some are made there. But no evidence of Minai production, no vessel sherds found anywhere.
And thousands of shards, actually, from in the Konya Museum, I think.
Yes, yeah, lots
of Minai.
Yeah, but all types, no vessels, and all from the Kilit Arslan excavations. Excavations. Some are official excavations, some are just ones that were found, and there's lots of them in Berlin. But no, this, if you put it next to any other piece of Lajvardina, everything about it is Lajvardina. You put it next to the white version of it, and the little star tile with the guy on a horse, and you're like, it's Minai, which kind of gets to the heart of this idea that there isn't such a clear late 12th, 13th, late 13th, early 14th, and that never the twain shall meet. Clearly they met and mingled.
And the piece on the right, what is
that? Is the top of one of the phoenix buds. That's the tails of the phoenix.
It's extraordinarily beautiful.
It's one of the. It's a very well presented. It's much more intricately painted than other Lajvardina tiles taken from the same mold. So it's definitely from Tati Suleiman. Now been excavated there. It's in the collection of tactiles in the Museum for Islamic Kunst in Berlin. But yeah, it's exceptionally high quality, even against the other very two ones. It's why I sort of picked it as the finest. And again, that's where you don't see any tiles with that decoration circulating in the manuscripts. The only evidence is these fragments that are definitely from this. Yes.
These crown riders all seem to have halos. Are
Yes.
they of any significance?
Yes, that is very common. I don't think it has the same religious connotation that it does in Christian art. It's fairly generic. I think that you know far more than me about this, so I'm more than happy to.
No religious connotation, it simply sets off the head. it
Aesthetic.
makes
Yeah.
you show, concentrates
Frame.
where the
Yes.
figure is, where the head is.
And often the most important, not always, but generally it's a, look at this, it probably comes visually from Buddhist art, but losing that religious frame. So the sort of the main figure is the one that they have real flames, so that's sort of reduced down to something that looks like, you say, like a halo. That obviously is a halo, but it's just not like it for the sake of the competitions. Yes, go ahead, sorry.
Could you tell me how's the style or the color combination interact with the china?
Well, blue and gold are very traditionally Mongol colours of wealth and prosperity. The dragon and the simode are long associated with royalty in China. There doesn't seem to be the yellow coming in, so the sort of the imperial yellow doesn't appear to penetrate. I mean, maybe into Yuan, I don't know Yuan at all, but certainly not in the Ilkhanid context. It's blue and gold seem to be. I don't know if it's because of the cost of them. You know, I think there's an argument why Mary's robes are blue in medieval manuscripts. It's because it's a long way from Badakhshan to Northumbria, where the stone finally got ground up and applied to manuscripts in scriptoria. I think it's expensive. It shows wealth and gold. Gold has always been, you can't do gold on cheap. People have tried it. But blue is also quite an expensive colour to make. So turquoise is the earliest colour you see for glazed tiles in the Islamic world, because the cheapest, easiest to make. If you've got a handful of fals, the cheapest, like copper coins, leave them out in the rain, you've got copper oxide, and that's what you need to make it. If you want to make cobalt and you want to make blue tiles like this, you have to get cobalt oxide. It's almost certainly going to come from a Kamsar near Kashan. So they've got a control on the market. They're able to charge high prices for it. And the percentage that you need isn't particularly high. I think it's between 1% and 4% in the glaze to get that rich blue. But once you're starting to do hundreds and hundreds of tiles, you're starting to need quite a lot. And if it's more expensive than gold, it doesn't matter how much you need. If even a small amount is really expensive. So I think it is as much the cost. But there's associations with the sky as well. And this is the starry firmament.
Do they use a lapis lazuli?
There is one scholar who's obsessed with the idea that they do use lapis lazuli, because it did one test on a monograph piece, which isn't even Lajvardina, and allegedly found alongside cobalt blue that there was some lapis lazuli in there. I think the main problem is that when you heat lapis lazuli, it turns white, so it's not going to do much good if it's blue. But no, you can't really use minerals as glazed pigments as a rule. They're all metal oxide.
So there's no lapis lazuli in Lajvardina?
No. No, I mean, they may, like I said, this guy did find traces of it. They may have been experimenting and seeing if it would help. It may have been that they wanted that sort of sparkliness from it. But no, cobalt oxide is the source of blue, all blue and glazes. Well, the blue and white Chinese wares, the Chinese have never been particularly interested in blue and white. It's always export ware. They're exporting plain white ware to the Islamic world, and it's a more blue on it, so they send blue back with them. It's from Iran. It's through Basra, they send cobalt oxide to the kilns in China, and it's not a purpose they want, because they wanted that aesthetic. But yeah, it always comes from cobalt. So you can get purplish tones with hematites. Usually for black, manganese oxide and purple as well. But that deep blue is really only possible.
Extraordinary. Thank you very much.
When is the book out? Yes.
You have to ask the peer reviewers. It depends entirely on their view of it.
And I have to say, the last book was excellent. Everyone should have it.
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
I think I think the best book on ceramics since early Islamic pottery.
I'd
say.
it's very
Really unbelievable.
well. It's hopefully not too long. So the series editor thought it was very good, so that's always a good sign. But yeah, have to wait for the peer reviewers to speak from behind the mask of anonymity.
And the different typology, I mean, unbelievable.
Well, they're using the same model, and looking more at the art market and more into the sort of second half of the 20th century, but broadly using the same model for that's what these are. Bearing in mind that there's a lot less vessels in that times. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I wonder if I can ask an unrelated question, which I do apologize in advance for it.
I don't know if I can answer it, but I'm definitely try.
I'm a historical linguist, and once I'm forced to study a lot about the historical perceptions of colors, so write 3 pages over the pre-modern understanding of colors. Have you come across in the works that you see people who were in workshops making these tiles or manuscripts use certain terminologies for certain colors? Because kind of the pre-modern understanding of color, which is out of the modern education, is based on the intensity of colors, and red or green or blue can be used to refer to something light or dark regarding the context. So have you ever seen a text have you ever encountered any people who do these works to use certain terminologies, coding each color and their differences?
There are only really 2 treaties that deal with this, one by Lajvardina and one by Al-Qasim al-Kashani, and both fairly well known and well studied in Persian, and they use the Persian terms for the colours, including actually it's a 16th century transcription of it that is the first that uses the term Lajvard for the blue colour, but most artisans in the pre-modern world weren't writing down what they were doing, they were too busy making the stuff. And the people writing weren't particularly interested in what the artisans were doing, or not how they did it anyway, they'd be interested in what they did. So there aren't a lot of written sources to rely on, but it is an interesting thing to pursue in terms of how those terms may have been understood in the past versus how they're viewed now. Yes, because I mean, I know certainly in Turkish they'll often use terms like the sky when they mean blue, but they're often referring to things that are actually turquoise or green. So it does become very confusing very quickly. But yeah, it is an interesting avenue of inquiry, but it's not one that I've been too busy handling broken bits of pots, as my children rapidly remind me. And they seem to think all I do is look at broken bits of pots, which unfortunately probably isn't too far from the truth, but it always hurts when someone actually points it out to you, especially if they're 9